Truth Unveiled here, and today I have a very interesting report to share with you. We're going to be talking about an interesting book that came out in the 1800s and how it relates to time travel, Trump, Pence, and the last president too. And this is a report from Newsweek that says, did an author from the 1800s predict the Trump's, Russia, and America's downfall? Let's find out. Now, there's been a whole lot of talk about this book, and I just wanted to share it with you, and we're going to be going over it later on. But here it says, Ingersoll Lockwood, an American political writer, lawyer, and novelist, combined a unique mixture of science fiction and fantasy into his novels from the late 1800s. Two of his most popular works of literature were illustrated children's stories, focusing on a peculiar fictional character whose name rings a bell in 2017, Baron Trump. Interesting. Then it says Trump, an aristocratically wealthy young man living in what's commonly known as Castle Trump, is the protagonist of Lockwood's first two fictional novels, The Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulger, which was released in 1890, and then 3 years later in 1893, Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. The little boy, who has an unending imagination and a quote, very active brain, is bored of the luxurious lifestyle he has grown so accustomed to, and so he then visits Russia to embark on an extraordinary adventure that will shape the rest of his life. And who does he embark upon? He embarks upon someone named Don, and we'll be talking about that too. And then the final novel arrived in 1896 entitled what? The Last President? And so we already see the startling and eerie similarities and connections between these books and today. For starters, how the main character's name is Baron Trump, which is very similar to Baron Trump. And then we also see how Trump's adventures begin in Russia, and that's all that they're constantly talking about, and is guided thanks to directions provided by, quote, the master of all masters named Don. Who does that remind us of? Now we're going to be going over two of the books. The first one is called Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. And what you're going to find out is that it has all to do with time traveling and traveling to other lands and traveling to other worlds. Should this concern us, especially with the different dimensions? But then there's another novel that Lockwood wrote, which is called The Last President. And now this one's separate from the Baron Trump series, but it's more eerily linked to the present day because the story begins with the scene from a panicked New York City in early November, describing a quote, state of uproar after the election of an enormously opposed outsider candidate. Who does that sound like? And then a quote from the book says, and we'll go over it together, the entire east side is in a state of uproar. Police officers shouted through the streets, warning city folk to stay indoors for the night. Mobs of vast size are organizing under the lead of anarchists and socialists and threaten to plunder and despoil the houses of the rich who have wronged and oppressed them for so many years. And there's also a mention of Fifth Avenue. Where else have I seen this before? Now this is from the science fiction encyclopedia that talks more about the author Ingersoll Lockwood and some of his writings and what he wrote. He was mostly a fantasy writer, and some of his novels included The Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulger, that was published in 1890, and then in 1893 Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey, and then what we're going to be going over also, that one and this one too, 1900 or The Last President, which is a near future political satire. Now here is the actual book from 1893 that's entitled Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. Now you can find it here in the full book at archive.org, and if you would like to read the entire thing you can. I'll be sure to leave it in the description box below. It's about 250 pages. And once again, it has to do with a rich child named Baron Trump who lives in what's known as, quote, Trump Castle, who then travels to Russia. After he leaves the castle, and again, note how Russia is mentioned, he's then assisted by a mentor named, quote unquote, Don. And it's also interesting because Don is a title for the full name, actually, who then helps him discover portals, allowing him to travel in time to different locations. And Don is also known as the Master of all Masters. And for once, even Snopes is admitting that this is true indeed, and we're going to be talking more about it. But as you can see right here, it's illustrated by a man named Charles Howard Johnson. who also illustrated the 1890 edition of the book known as The Princess by English poet Alfred L. Tennyson, and then it was also published by Lee and Shepard Publishers of Boston, Massachusetts, which was a 19th century publishing firm in Boston by men named William Lee and Charles Shepard. But in 1905, this publishing house was merged with Lothrop to form Lothrop, Lee, and Shepard, and then eventually acquired by William Morrow and Company, who would then be acquired by HarperCollins in 1999. Now we'll briefly just go over the book real quick, but this is page 7 of the book from chapter 2 that talks about Don Fum's mysterious directions, and it says here at the very beginning, according to the learned Don Fum's manuscript, the portals to the world within a world were situated somewhere in northern Russia, possibly, so he thought, from all indications somewhere on the westerly slope of the upper Urals. Other worlds, what are they really alluding to? What is really going on here? Is this really a fiction or a fantasy? Let's find out, because then the next page we see on page 8, and this book also has illustrations too, that Castle Trump is also mentioned. So why is this book alluding to Trump and time travel? What are they really alluding to here? And then this pamphlet that he wrote here, which is called 1900 or The Last President. Now this is separate from the Baron Trump series, and this came out in 1896. And coincidentally enough, with the title on here, The Last President, we see a whole lot of similarities in this book that remind us of things that are even going on today. Because just on chapter 1, the book begins about a president who's elected, or should we say selected, whom the world does not take a liking to. Does this sound familiar? And it starts where? In New York City in November of 1896, and it starts also with what? A mob going on after Bryan is elected president of the United States, and it talks all about mobs of vast sizes attacking and everything. And then if you keep going to the next pages and go a couple of pages onward, on page 5 you see that the Fifth Avenue is mentioned. Where else have I seen this before? With Donald Trump in November of 2016, with Fifth Avenue also mentioned. Wow, very interesting and suspicious indeed. Now what I also thought was very cryptic about this book was on page 15, where it talks about a strange prophecy and alludes to what's called the Dawnless Day. And I'll be sure to leave this in the description box below, because you can take a look at the entire thing and the book that we just went over before. But it's interesting because this reminded me of what the eclipse that's going to be coming up real soon, and now less than 3 weeks from now, because it says the hour of daybreak, such an impenetrable pall of clouds overhung the city that there came no signs of day. Oh my goodness. But then if you go to the next page, it talks more about the cabinet members of the new president that was elected, and guess what one of the names of the cabinet members is? Secretary of Agriculture Leif Pence of Colorado. The word Pence right there, just like Mike Pence. Oh, Trump and Pence, Trumpets, trumpets. Oh my goodness, what is this alluding to? In the title of this, The Last President, and then the very first thing that they pass is an executive order, just like Trump too. No surprise or coincidence there either. The book also alludes to many strange prophecies, many that we've already gone over, but one also too is here on page 37, or the very beginning of chapter 9, that talks about the rebellion. It talks about that the mighty North, rich with 100 great cities and strong in the conscious power of its wide empire, would be the next to raise the standard of rebellion against the federal government. What does that sound like? Almost sounds like Russia. Now this book also purports common themes throughout the entire story, like here on page 41 in chapter 10, it talks about Congress and it talks about a bank holiday. It also talks too mostly about taxes and having to do with the banks, and talking about the acts and how the act was supposed to cover pensions for soldiers. But the book talks so much about taxes and the IRS, and mind you, this is before the IRS was even established in 1913. What is it really alluding to? But as the book keeps going, and towards the end of the book, it talks about how the people, of course, want the president out of the White House. And then as it keeps going on page 44, it even makes a quote alluding to the Sabbath. It also talks about some of the prophets and lamentations of Jeremiah 2. But then as it keeps going on, I find this quote very interesting and suspicious indeed, where it says, not only a new year, but a new century was about to break upon the world, more like the New World Order. And then the book on page 45, a Republican leader says this quote here, where it says, quote, that hour has sounded for us. Which hour? And then the very next page on page 46, where the speaker says, quote, the president must withdraw. And that's all they've been talking about in mainstream news, is Trump leaving office and making jokes and even references to assassination attempts and all of these different things that they're doing subliminally. Why is that the case? But then what's also interesting and suspicious indeed about this is the next page on page 47, this paragraph right here that says, the new year, the new century was born, but with the last stroke, a fearful and thunderous discharge as of 1,000 monster pieces of artillery shook the Capitol to its very foundations, making the stoutest hearts stand still, and blanching cheeks that had never known the coward color. The dome of the Capitol had been destroyed by dynamite. And this is the very end of the book, as you can see right here. But that's interesting, because where else have we seen that, and where else have we heard that when it comes to the Capitol building being destroyed? Oh yeah, that's right, the TV show known as Designated Survivor that came out last year, because the pilot also alluded to the exact same thing. Very interesting and suspicious indeed, and also talked about how they had to get rid of the president too. But if you thought the idea of time travel was just only in fiction and was only in movies, well, think again, because now we're going to be going over secret cover-up time travel projects and experimentations. And the first is Project Pegasus, which according to lawyer Andrew D. Basiago, this was a classified project via the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA. The same agency conducting robots and mind control techniques was involved with altering time and going back and forth through time through other portals, gateways, doorways, and dimensions. That's why we should be very concerned about this. But this is when the US defense technical community achieved time travel for the alphabet soup companies for, quote, reliable information. And Andrew D. Basiago was involved in an experiment where 140 school children were involved with time travel teleportation, courtesy the fallen ones. And now, via Project Pegasus, Basiago is now petitioning the US government to declassify all of their cover-ups and schemes on time travel and the technology, along with teleportation. And that's the second thing, known as the Philadelphia experiment, which was a teleportation experiment and the Navy's attempt to make the US destroyer ship invisible during World War II. And there were claims made that on October 28, 1943, the ship known as USS Eldridge was made to disappear from view so that the enemy ships could not see it during the war, but was then teleported from Philadelphia all the way to Norfolk, Virginia in an experimentation that, of course, was kept a secret, and this is also known as Project Rainbow. And what's also interesting is that this experimentation actually comes from Nikola Tesla's drawings and calculations and how it came into fruition, and we'll be talking more about that later on with John Trump, which is Trump's uncle.